Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 7 hidden gems for the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about players that you may consider to be sleeper options, but I like to call them my hidden gems based on everyone's favorite cinematic universe. So, over the course of today's video, I'm going to be talking about 6 individual players, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions while also presenting statistics in order to justify the reasons that we're starting them. Again, majority of these players, either first and foremost, aren't even rostered in very many leagues or don't have a very high start percentage going into week 7. And based on what happened earlier this week with the snap, 2 teams on bye, and the plethora of injuries that many of our fantasy teams have sustained over the course of this season, we're going to need players to plug in for week 7 in order to help us capture a victory. So we're going to talk about these players and, of course, get you on the right track to capturing that victory in week 7. Now, before we get into today's content, a reminder, at the end of today's video, I will be putting together a couple entries in regards to Underdog. Again, if you guys haven't checked them out already, go down to the description at this current moment in time. If you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you'll get my rankings sent for my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, flex, half PPR, and full PPR, all-encompassing rankings in order to help you set your lineups every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. So for those of you who are wondering if you're eligible to potentially tail some of the entries today and potentially go ahead and take advantage of those rankings, check out the map to the right side of the screen. And if you're not eligible based on your current location, or if you've used the code in the past, you can find all-encompassing rankings via the Patreon. Link is also down in the description. Via the Patreon, you can also ask me unlimited questions for the remainder of the season. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's get into talking about my hidden gems for week 7, beginning with the Soul Stone. It is, in fact, Nick Chubb. The sacrifice of someone that we love needed to be made in order for Nick Chubb to come off of the PUP list, the physically unable to perform, and be a starter going into week 7. That player was Jerome Ford, a running back that we love this offseason, and in the absence of Nick Chubb, has served well in many of circumstances. Now, going into this week, Jerome Ford has already been designated out, and Nick Chubb, after 3 full weeks of practice, is now able to be active and be a starting running back for the Cleveland Browns. And even though the Cleveland Browns have not been a competitive football team as of late, hopefully Nick Chubb is going to give them that jump and that juice that they require in order to take on their division rival, the Cincinnati Bengals. A defense that, again, cannot stop the run based on what they have demonstrated thus far this season on average. Over the course of the season, weeks 1 through 6, the Bengals are allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs based on rushing statistics isolated. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Over the course of the season, that's a 16.48 fantasy point per game average just in those overall statistics. That's a 4.43 yard per carry average allowed to opposing running backs. Just most recently this last week, Tyrone Tracy had himself an incredible game. And yes, he got himself a lot of receiving utilization, but who's to say that Nick Chubb isn't going to be implicated for that kind of a workload? Over the course thus far this season, the Cleveland Browns have given their running backs 17 rushing attempts and 6 targets per game on average. So if Nick Chubb is going to be the starting running back of this team going forward, a more talented back than what they have with Deontay Foreman, Pierre Strong, even if Nyheim Hines even plays this week, Nick Chubb is the by far and away number 1 back, and he would be implicated for the vast majority of those overall opportunities going into the given week. Now, even though, again, we've talked about the fact that this Cleveland Browns team isn't great, Deshaun Watson at the helm, they just lost Amari Cooper via trade, their offensive line is getting healthy. 4 of their 5 expected starters from the beginning of the year are active as of this week. The only one that's not active is their all-pro right guard, which again is a huge miss, but in this overall circumstance, when you still have 4 of the 5 starting offensive linemen available and healthy, ready to go, this will give Nick Chubb even more variable upside in regards to the matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, which of course this team is very familiar with. Over the course of the last couple seasons here, the Cleveland Browns have a 6-2 win-loss record against the Cincinnati Bengals. They've only lost a handful of times, and in these circumstances, it's because of the injuries that they have sustained. So if going into this upcoming week, there's going to be a possibility of the juice of Nick Chubb kind of elevating this offense and this offensive line and the running attack, anticipate a lot of success. He's currently only being started in 11% of leagues, which I believe is far too low, especially considering the entire running back landscape as it stands going into week 7. So if in fact Nick Chubb is on your roster, perhaps sitting in your IR spot, drop somebody, put him into your potential lineup if you need an RB3/flex option going into the week, because I truly do believe there's a lot of potential within the upcoming game, especially considering the Cleveland Browns, they didn't look bad last week. They were quite competitive last week against the Philadelphia Eagles offensively and defensively. So there may be an opportunity here where Nick Chubb can get himself a huge, bounce back, comeback performance to begin the season. All right, let's move on to the next hidden gem. We have the reality stone of DEMARIO Douglas, also known as Pop Douglas. The reality of the situation is that going into this week, Sunday morning, starting at 6:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, there is a game between the Jacksonville Jaguars and New England Patriots, of course, in London. Again, I will be live streaming here on the channel beginning at 6 a.m. So if you have any questions, there's going to be a 4-hour live stream this upcoming Sunday morning. This will be the third consecutive in a row with 4+ hours. But as of right now, DEMARIO Douglas, only being started in 19% of leagues and rostered in 40% of leagues, is a player that I've talked about all week long. And I really do believe that he's going to find success because this is one of the easiest matchups you could possibly ask for based on the fact that they're going to London and he has a rookie quarterback only taking his second start. But from what we have seen from the Jacksonville Jaguars, they're allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers based on receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns allowed. On a per game average thus far this season, the Jacksonville Jaguars are allowing 22 targets, 16 receptions, 192 receiving yards, and 1.33 touchdowns per game on average to opposing wide receivers. So when we look at the entire receiving landscape of the New England Patriots, really DEMARIO Douglas is by far and away the number one, especially considering over the course of the 3 of the last 4 games that he has participated in within this offense, he has been able to surpass 9 or more targets. The opportunity volume is there, and based on the fact that not only is the Jaguars one of the best matchup at the wide receiver position, they're also allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. They've also allowed the most passing touchdowns by opposing quarterbacks thus far this season amongst all teams in the National Football League. Drake May's second start is going to be an easy one, and looking in the direction of DEMARIO Douglas, who had a 27% target share last week, is only going to potentially increase going into this week, especially considering DEMARIO Douglas plays the vast majority of his overall snaps and runs, the vast majority of his overall routes out of the slot position. Thus far this season, playing 80% from the slot position. Over the course of this season, the Jacksonville Jaguars have not been able to stop opposing slot receiving options. Most recently, Keenan Allen of last week was a hidden gem, primarily because they were taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars and they cannot stop opposing slot receivers. Keenan Allen in that game, 5 catches for 41 and 2 receiving touchdowns. The week prior, Josh Downs, 9 catches for 69. The week prior to that, Stephon Diggs, 5 catches for 69 and a touchdown. Shakir, 6 catches for 72 and a touchdown. Slot receiving options for 4 consecutive weeks have dominated against this defense. DEMARIO Douglas, who's coming off an incredible performance and consecutive weeks of high level of opportunity, the expectation is that with Drake May at quarterback, in this London game, even though London games are typically weird, they're going to find success going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, speaking of the Jaguars, let's talk about the other side of this overall matchup and the potential of Tank Bigsby, a player that I truly do believe has an opportunity this week to step up due to the injury that has been sustained by, Travis Etienne. And you may be wondering which injury. Honestly, all of them. At this point, Travis Etienne gets injured every single week. And as of right now, based on what we've heard from the coaching staff of the Jacksonville Jaguars, Etienne is still week to week with a hamstring injury. He's still probably dealing with a shoulder injury if I had to guess so myself. But as we approach week 7, the power stone is going to be Tank Bigsby, a power back that has himself an opportunity, who's, again, only being rostered in 66% of leagues, but only being started in 30% of leagues going into the week. I understand it mainly because, again, there is a little bit of uncertainty as to whether or not Etienne is active, but I believe that even if Etienne is active, we have seen Tank Bigsby do enough within the running game in a positive game script to be the dominating factor within the overall contest. We're talking about Tank Bigsby, who is averaging 7.24 yards per carry thus far this season. A player that in the games in which they have had positive game scripts, specifically week 1 against Miami and week 5 against the Indianapolis Colts, in both of those games was a driving force of why this team was able to stay competitive and maintain the lead for a majority of the contest, mainly based on his rushing efforts. In those 2 games, the Jacksonville Jaguars running backs, 24 attempts and 20 attempts. And when you take on the New England Patriots, the expectation at a base minimum is a positive game script, or at least a neutral game script in which the running game is going to still be a consistent part of the play calling in comparison to many of the other overall instances that we have seen the Jacksonville Jaguars participate in thus far this season. Now, when we talk about the advantage that Tank Bigsby has taken on the New England Patriots, again, they're the 5th best matchup at the position, allowing 17.67 fantasy points per game based on running back rushing statistics isolated. And that's really all that matters because Tank Bigsby doesn't get himself any receiving utilization. Therefore, in Sunday's game, we're anticipating a lot of upside, especially considering the last 4 games, the Patriots have allowed the following statistics to opposing running backs. Houston Texans running backs combined for 185 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Miami running backs, 184 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. San Francisco running backs, 123 and a touchdown. New York Jets running backs, 115 and a touchdown. That is 4 consecutive weeks of over 115 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown minimum to opposing running backs. So why not Tank Bigsby going into the week? I think is the perfect option for this week's Power Stone. Moving on to the space zone. Every single week, we have a wide receiver within the space zone, mainly because it's a player that I believe is going to shoot for the moon and fall amongst the stars. The players that is really going to go to space and find themselves a lot of success. Now, as of right now, Jordan Whittington is only being rostered in 8% of leagues and only started in 1% of leagues, which really isn't a surprise, mainly because there is the factor of Cooper Kupp potentially returning. But considering they have already designated Cooper Kupp as a game time decision, I truly do believe that there's a possibility that Cooper Kupp doesn't even play this week. And if that is going to take place, I mean, there's a lot of upside in the form of Jordan Whittington based on what we've recently seen from his overall contributions within this offense. Specifically, going back to the last 2 games that he has played as a primary starter of the Los Angeles Rams. 8 targets, 6 receptions, 62. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 89. His most recent game against the Green Bay Packers back in week 5 prior to the bye week, again, was getting himself an exposure of opportunity that we hadn't seen earlier in the year. And as long as those opportunities are going to continue to flow in his direction, Jordan Whittington is going to be of value. Basically, what we have seen from Sean McVay and his offenses over the course of his entire career as the head coach of the Los Angeles Rams is that they like to use 3 wide receivers, and that's it. And they always want to run 11 personnel sets, about 92+% of the time. And those 3 wide receivers are Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington, and Demarcus Robinson. They're not going to leave the field. And as long as Cooper Kupp is not implicated within the overall matchup, I truly do believe that there is a possibility where Jordan Whittington can pick up where he left off, especially taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. I mean, we're talking about a defense that thus far this season has allowed 5 catches for 39 and a touchdown to Ladd McConkey, 7 for 91 and a touchdown to Zay Flowers, 8 for 122 and a touchdown to Deontay Johnson, 6 for 72 to Jerry Jeudy. And even though the statistics for wide receivers over the course of the last 2 games, taking on Denver and Pittsburgh, again, you know, those quarterbacks and those receivers don't really mesh for very many fantasy point upside weeks. There's still a high level of potential in which we can see Jordan Whittington shoot for the moon and fall amongst the stars and have himself another incredible week for fantasy purposes. Again, if he's available in your league and you're desperate for a potential flex or wide receiver 3, he certainly can give your fantasy team the boost that it needs going into the week. All right, let's move on to the time stone. And in the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Austin Ekeler, running back of the Washington Commanders. Now, it's time. Listen, anytime we are in a situation in which our running backs are taking on the Carolina Panthers, it is all systems go. We are firing up every single running back in that scenario. Now, going into this week, Brian Robinson Jr. is still questionable to play. Brian Robinson did not play last week against the Baltimore Ravens overall matchup, and if in fact that injury is still going to sustain and be an issue and potentially have him either first and foremost limited or not even play at all, Austin Ekeler is going to be a huge factor. Currently only started in 40% of leagues. I think that number needs to double. Quite frankly, as of the entire course of this season, in a full PPR, he's put up over 10 fantasy points every single game. In a half PPR, he's put up over 8.2 fantasy points every single game. The opportunity is there now this week, taking on the Carolina Panthers, the best matchup at the position, as they're allowing 25.38 fantasy points per game based on rushing statistics isolated. Over the course of the last 3 weeks, they have allowed 14.5 plus fantasy points to 6 different running backs. Chase Brown, Zach Moss in the same game. Swift and Roschon in the same game. Bijan and Algier in the same game. Not only that, they've also allowed 2 rushing touchdowns to 3 different running backs in the last 3 weeks. One of those running backs being Chase Brown, the other being Roschon Johnson, and the last being Bijan Robinson. But either way, every single running back that I just mentioned, those 6, all scored touchdowns against this defense. The expectation is the Washington Commanders are going to take an early lead. Again, this is an offense that has dominated over the course of this entire season. And whether or not we do see Brian Robinson in the lineup, Austin Ekeler is going to be implicated with a lot of garbage time in that second half. Or potentially, if he's the starter this week, he's going to be implicated to have himself touchdowns galore and a lot of upside, considering this defense cannot stop the run or the pass. Therefore, Austin Ekeler is an automatic start. I talked about it earlier this week in regards to my running back rankings at a top 40 capacity. Videos on the channel if you guys are interested. But I mentioned it, like Austin Ekeler, I think is going to significantly outproduce his overall ranking. Obviously, we're still waiting on the overall, designation of Brian Robinson Jr., but it would not surprise me if Austin Ekeler finishes at a top 15 running back based on the overall matchup and opportunity that he continues to get every single week. And even without scoring a touchdown, he is still fantasy relevant. Imagine now, he's guaranteed almost a touchdown this week. He's going to have himself like 16 plus points in a half PPR, I'm anticipating. Moving on to the final option, we have the Mind Stone, and it is CADE, tight end of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, over the course of this week, we have seen that Mike Evans has been questionable and has, in fact, not even practiced the last 2 days. Now, he is a veteran. Mike Evans does not have to practice in order for him to go ahead and be active by Sunday's game. Or actually, in fact, it will be Monday's game going into the overall matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. Again, we have a doubleheader on Monday night. We have the Ravens taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Chargers taking on the overall Arizona Cardinals. So going into this upcoming week, there is a little bit of uncertainty as to whether or not Mike Evans is going to play. I'm anticipating him to do so, but either way, when we take on a matchup like the Baltimore Ravens, we're talking about an opportunity for CADE OTTON to get himself even more exposure to targets and upside, mainly because, look, CADE OTTON in the last 4 games has averaged 6.75 targets per game. Nearly 7 per game in the last 4 weeks is great. He's coming off of a week in which he had a season-high 8.5 fantasy points, scored himself his first touchdown of the season, and now has an opportunity of taking on the 6th best matchup at the tight end position against the Baltimore Ravens. They've allowed 10.35 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends based on receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Most recently, these are the statistics from tight end groups against the Baltimore Ravens over the course of the season. Washington last week, 4 catches for 68. Cincinnati the week prior, 4 for 41. Buffalo, 6 for 47. Dallas, 7 for 100. Las Vegas, 10 for 109. And Kansas City, 6 for 71. There is a lot of opportunity here, especially with, this being a pass-heavy game. Especially when you're taking on the Baltimore Ravens, it is almost impossible to run the ball on a consistent basis against them. And considering the Buccaneers are coming off of an incredible week of running the ball, they may think that they have a potential attack in plan to be able to go after this defense, but really it's going to be, a very difficult task on hand to run the ball. Therefore, if it's Baker Mayfield passing for the entirety of the second half of this game, Mike Evans a little bit banged up, Chris Godwin, CADE OTTON are the number 1 and 2 options. There should be a lot of target opportunity and potentially a lot of upside in the overall experience based on the fact that the Ravens have not been able to stop opposing tight ends thus far this season. That is my anticipation, and that is the last hidden gem for this week. Now that we've covered our hidden gems, let's go ahead and transition into talking about some underdog entries going into this weekend. Do not forget that if you go ahead and sign up today using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, again, not only are you going to get the first time deposit offer, not only are you going to get my rankings every Sunday morning, but you'll be able to take advantage of the new customer special 0.5 total yards for Aaron Rodgers as they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers this upcoming weekend. Of course, Aaron Rodgers, he gets Devontae Adams back. So 0.5 total yards is a guarantee, but he may be able to do even beyond that. Maybe 3 passing touchdowns could be in line. We'll have to wait and see. But let's go ahead and talk about my 2 favorite picks every single week. Again, over the course of this entire season, I've put in $1,000 plus of entries every single week, and I'm up a lot. And last week was another one of those weeks in which we hit big, and we're going to continue to find success. So I've gone ahead and curated the following overall plays. This is a $500 entry going into this weekend where I have Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Kyren Williams all going higher than their overall statistics. Kyren Williams, anytime touchdown, and Devontae Smith and Amon-Ra going higher on their receiving yards. And let me explain to you exactly the context as to why I believe this is going to happen. Kyren Williams is pretty easy. He's the guarantee, and he's the likeliest of the overall options to hit, mainly because thus far this season, he has been able to score at least 1 rushing touchdown minimum in each of the last 5 consecutive games. They took on the Raiders. It is an advantageous matchup, and Kyren Williams is a touchdown monster. Even looking back at 2023, in the 12 games he played, he scored 15 total touchdowns. He scored a touchdown in 9 of the 12 games in the 2023 season, and that's when they had Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua always vying for potential upside. In this week, you may not have either of the two, so it'll go back to being a run-first attack, in which we have seen over the course of the last 3 weeks, in the absence of Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, Kyren Williams averaging 22 rushing attempts per game, over 95 rushing yards per game, and over a 1 rushing touchdown per game on average, and also gets himself a couple receiving touchdowns over the course of the season as well. But either way, he's an automatic in my mind. Now, as for the next option, let's move up and let's talk about Devontae Smith. Devontae Smith and his overall number has gone up about 3 yards over the course of the last, I would say, 8 to 12 hours, mainly because of the designation of Dallas Goedert being out. Now that we have full confirmation of that, when we look at the most recent games in which Devontae Smith has played without Dallas Goedert in the lineup, going back to 2023 and 2022, there have been 7 different instances. In these games, these are the following receiving yard numbers from Devontae Smith: 99, 106, 96. Those are all from last season in the 3 games in which we saw Dallas Goedert miss. Then we go back to 2022, 78, 102, 64, 126, and 50. The only game in which he got himself 50 receiving yards is a game in which he had 9 targets and only 4 receptions. But going up against the New York Giants this week, I truly do believe that this number of 60.5 receiving yards is easily capable for Devontae Smith within this offensive attack, especially when everyone's trying to stop Saquon Barkley. They're going to be airing it out and looking in the direction of Devontae Smith, who has found himself an abundance of success thus far this season within this offense. Again, over the course of the year, excluding last week, has been able to surpass this number every single time out. So I do believe that the number only sits right there is because really the overall underdog kind of system believes that there's a possibility of him going lower. I don't think there's a chance of that. I think he easily eclipses that number. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown, higher than 72.5 receiving yards. Look, the fact of the matter is, we have seen a lot of success from slot receiving options as George Pickens said it earlier this week, slot merchants against the overall Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings are the easiest matchup at the wide receiver position thus far this season. But for slot receiving options, we have seen Byron Murphy, their primary nickel cornerback, struggle mightily. Over the course of this season, he has allowed the 8th most targets, 9th most receptions, and 7th most receiving yards to opposing slot receiving options. And Josh Metellus, their other, kind of nickel back that they usually use as a safety, but then he plays nickel, every now and then. He has also struggled within the overall context. I mean, thus far this season, both of them are handling 70% of the slot coverage for the Vikings this year. And even going back to last season, Murphy, Metellus, and Cam Bynum all struggled against opposing slot receiving options. So it's no surprise that thus far this season, we have seen Jaden Reed, 7 catches for 138 and a touchdown against this defense. Stephon Diggs, 10 for 94. Deebo Samuel, 8 for 110. Wanda Robinson, even if you go back to all the way week 1, Wanda Robinson was given 12 targets, only made 6 receptions for 44. There is so much opportunity. And when you take into context the fact that Amon-Ra St. Brown has dominated against this defense with Brian Flores as the DC, as Byron Murphy was the slot nickel cornerback last season for this team, when we talk about the context of the fact that last season against this defense, Amon-Ra St. Brown went for 12 catches, 106 and a touchdown. And then in the following game against the Minnesota Vikings, 7 catches for 144 and a touchdown. I truly do believe that this 72.5 receiving yard number is very much so accomplishable in a game in which is expected to be the highest scoring game of the overall week, in a shootout between these two overall offenses, taking on defenses that truly cannot stop opposing wide receivers. All right, let's move on to the second play of the week. Another $500 entry for $22.80. This is, a play that I believe is an automatic. Again, first and foremost, speaking of automatics, let's talk about Derrick Henry. Again, Derrick Henry thus far this season has scored 1 rushing touchdown or receiving touchdown minimum every single game. But even if we exclude the 6 consecutive streak of scoring a touchdown, in the last 4 games, 3 of those games have consisted of 2 or more touchdowns. Derrick Henry is an automatic. Not only that, he's also covered by the vulture protection. If in fact Lamar Jackson steals a rushing touchdown down in the end zone, Derrick Henry's protected, and your entry will be able to find itself success regardless of that fact. Even if Derrick Henry doesn't score a touchdown and Lamar Jackson steals one, or Zay Flowers runs one in, or potentially a fullback runs one in, it doesn't matter. You will be protected. Now, let's move on to like Travis Kelce, for example. Going higher than 60.5 receiving yards is a cakewalk. I mean, let's talk about it. In the last 2 weeks, in the absence of Rashee Rice, 10 targets, 9 catches, 70, 9 targets, 7 catches, 89. The volume of upside that is going to be implicated for this overall performance is going to be very high because, like I mentioned yesterday, in regards to my quarterback and tight end rankings video, Andy Reid has the highest win percentage amongst all coaches coming off of the bye week, an 84% win percentage in his career. Not only that, we're in a situation going into the overall week in which we have an opportunity of Travis Kelce taking on a defense that he is very much so familiar with. In the last 2 games in which he has taken on the San Francisco 49ers back in 2023, the playoffs in the Super Bowl last year, in 2022, 8 targets, 6 catches, 98, 10 targets, 9 catches, 93 in the Super Bowl game. I mean, again, even if you take into account tight ends, most recently against the San Francisco 49ers, Seattle Seahawks tight end 7 for 76, Arizona Cardinals tight ends 8 for 60. There is so much potential for upside within the overall contest. I'm anticipating Travis Kelce as the number 1 receiving option of this game to clearly be able to surpass this number as he has done in each of the last 2 weeks by 30 plus yards nearly. All right, then the final option, we have Devon Achane. Look, the fact of the matter is Devon Achane has not looked great in the absence of Tua Tagovailoa. Only averaging 2.6 yards per carry is not getting the job done without Tua in the lineup. But a 44.5 rushing yard number is very much so accomplishable when you take into account the Colts are allowing 4.34 yards per carry to opposing running backs. They're allowing 120 rushing yards per game on average to opposing running backs. And additionally, these are the following statistics from running backs against this Colts defense as of thus far this season. You go back to week 1. Houston, 175 and a touchdown. Green Bay, 175 on the ground as well. Then we got Chicago with DeAndre Swift in the shambles, go for only 59. Then we had Pittsburgh, 67. But then most recently, in the last 2 weeks, Jacksonville running it down their throat, 119 and 2 rushing touchdowns. And then Tennessee with 122 and a rushing touchdown, despite the fact that Will Levis only had 95 passing yards in the game. It does not matter. Devon Achane is eclipsing this number and bringing home the money. All right, that's going to cover my favorite picks going into this weekend. Again, I will go ahead and talk about other picks as we progress throughout the weekend in the upcoming live streams. Later tonight, I'll be live streaming around 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Additionally, Saturday afternoon, 1 to 3 p.m. and Sunday morning starting at 6 a.m. like I mentioned earlier today and over the course of this entire week. But that's going to cover my hidden gems of the week, my favorite plays of the week in regards to underdog entries. Be sure to go ahead, sign up today using code Andrew. But if in fact you already have an account, but you still want to get those rankings, you can always check out the Patreon links also down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. If you have not yet already, be sure to click the like button. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.